I experienced it myself. Now, I don't live it every day, but the 1,000 new roadblocks all across the West Bank means planning to be sitting for hours, to be blocked for hours when you're trying to go to your offices, to your jobs, to your businesses. I met with the Chamber of Commerce. It is it's a stranglehold on allowing Palestinians across the West Bank to try to live independently and in dignity. And not to mention some of the other humiliations they face every day in the struggle and the suffering. I was in a community of Betskaria where there have been a huge increase of illegal settlements.
You just watched the Oxfam chief articulate with chilling precision what Palestinians experience every single day under the weight of Israeli occupation. And you need to understand that this is not some isolated complaint or rhetorical flourish from a disgruntled NGO official, but rather testimony from someone who has witnessed firsthand the machinery of systematic suffocation that is grinding the Palestinian population into submission through bureaucratic violence and militarized control of the most basic elements of human existence. Because what you heard in that clip is the description of a political architecture deliberately designed to make Palestinian life economically non-viable and socially unsustainable. And if you think this testimony is somehow controversial or partisan, let me tell you that the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs documented We49 movement obstacles that permanently or intermittently restrict the movement of 3.3 million Palestinians across the West Bank as of early 2025, and critically 6 were installed between December 2024 and February 2025, with the majority erected between mid-January and February 2025, coinciding with the announcement of the Gaza ceasefire, meaning that at the very moment when the world's attention celebrated a pause in Gaza's destruction, the Israeli government escalated its chokehold on Palestinians in the West Bank, in what amounts to one of history's most cynical exercises in misdirection, convincing the international community that peace was breaking out while tightening the noose in another part of Palestine where cameras were not as focused and where suffering could be rendered invisible through the mundane cruelty of roadblocks and checkpoints. The word stranglehold is not hyperbole, and it is not inflammatory rhetoric chosen to score political points, but rather the clinically accurate description of a policy regime that has rendered Palestinian economic life dependent on permission from an occupying power that withholds that permission as a matter of routine, political control. And when the Oxfam CEO talks about sitting for hours at roadblocks just to reach offices and workplaces, and watching members of a Chamber of Commerce describe the absolute impossibility of conducting normal business under these conditions, you need to recognize that we are talking about the deliberate economic annihilation of an entire people through the weaponization of mobility itself, because as of last November 28, Israel had 793 checkpoints and roadblocks in the West Bank, 228 more than before the war in Gaza, and this number has only grown with 29 new gates installed across the West Bank, bringing the overall number of open or closed road gates to 288, constituting a third of movement obstacles, of which about 60% are frequently closed gates, creating a situation where Palestinians wake up each morning with absolutely no certainty about whether they will be able to reach their jobs or their families or medical care, because the infrastructure of control is designed to be arbitrary and unpredictable, and thus maximally destabilizing to any semblance of normal life. And if you think I am exaggerating the psychological warfare embedded in this system, then consider that the same soothing female voice can be heard emanating from countless car radios, reeling off every Israeli checkpoint, followed by Salik Arabic for open or Muklak, closed, based on the conditions of the moment, with these reports recently beating out weather broadcasts for top slot on the West Bank radio lineup, turning the question of whether you can reach work into the same kind of unpredictable natural disaster as a storm, except that storms are not designed by human hands to inflict maximum humiliation and economic devastation. What is happening here is not security measures designed to protect Israeli citizens from terrorism, but rather the engineering of what international law recognizes as collective punishment and what historical analysis understands as the physical manifestation of apartheid, because these checkpoints are not placed at the borders of Israel proper, but rather throughout occupied Palestinian territory in a pattern that slices up the occupied West Bank and creates choke points the Israeli army can shut off on a whim, and we know from reporting that crossings that had been open 24/7 started closing during morning and evening rush hours, upturning the lives of hundreds of thousands of people, meaning that the policy is explicitly designed to disrupt Palestinian life at the moments when disruption will cause maximum economic and social damage, during the hours when children need to get to school, and workers need to reach employment, and sick people need access to medical facilities, and the agency's latest report noted a surge in suffocating restrictions that are tearing communities apart and largely paralyzing daily life. Language that echoes the stranglehold metaphor with the precision of bureaucratic observation, confirming what humanitarian workers witness on the ground. The cruelty here is not incidental, but central to the design, not a regrettable side effect of security requirements, but the deliberate weaponization of geography and infrastructure to make Palestinian self-determination impossible by rendering Palestinian economic independence a fantasy. And you need to grasp that when the Oxfam CEO mentions 160,000 illegal settlements, she is referencing the other side of this equation, the fact that while Palestinians are trapped at checkpoints, unable to reach their olive groves or their markets, Israeli settlers are moving freely throughout the West Bank on segregated bypass roads, building illegal communities on stolen land, with the full protection of the Israeli military and the full financial backing of the Israeli government. And if you think the numbers I'm citing sound abstract, then let me make this viscerally concrete by telling you that Taysir checkpoint that connects the northern Jordan Valley with Jenin Nablus and the western areas of Tubas Governorate was closed for 2 months following a shooting attack by a Palestinian that killed 2 Israeli soldiers, significantly obstructing the movement of over 60,000 Palestinians to workplaces, markets, health facilities, and schools. And when it reopened, the detours extended the journey by up to 2 hours instead of the usual 30-minute trip, meaning that a person who used to have an hour commute now faces 4 hours each way just to reach work, effectively making employment impossible for thousands of families. And this is collective punishment by definition, punishing an entire population of 60,000 people for the actions of one individual, in a policy that would be immediately recognized as a war crime if it were implemented by any nation that the United States and Europe were not committed to defending, regardless of the brutality involved. The International Court of Justice has been crystal clear on this point, finding in 2024 that Israel's occupation was illegal, and ruled that Israel had an obligation to cease immediately all new settlement activities and to evacuate all settlers from the occupied territories. And yet not only has Israel refused to comply with this ruling, but it has accelerated its settlement expansion, with the Israeli Ministry of Defense announcing on 28 May 2025 that the Security Cabinet had approved a proposal to recognize 22 new settlements, demonstrating the utter contempt that the Israeli government has for international law and for the institutions that are supposed to uphold it. The settlement expansion happening simultaneously with checkpoint proliferation is not coincidental, but rather reveals the larger strategic project at work here, which is the de facto annexation of the West Bank, through facts on the ground that make any future Palestinian state geographically impossible. All the new settlements are in areas deep inside the West Bank territories that in any future agreement and in all negotiation frameworks were considered areas designated for a Palestinian state, but deliberately targeting the land that would form the territorial basis of Palestinian sovereignty in order to render that sovereignty impossible before negotiations even resume. And the government is on track to approve over 50,000 units by the end of 2025, more than the previous 5 years of construction advancement combined, a pace of colonization that represents the most aggressive settlement expansion in decades, and that coincides with the return of Donald Trump to the White House, whose administration has made clear that it will provide full diplomatic cover for Israeli annexation while abandoning even the pretense of support for Palestinian statehood. The United States Ambassador to Israel Mike Huckabee declared in June 2025 that he opposes the establishment of a Palestinian state at this time, noting that unless there are some significant things that happen that change the Palestinian culture, there is no room for it. And when asked if a Palestinian state is still the goal of U.S. policy, replied, "I don't think so," marking what analysts describe as a fundamental break from 25 years of official American policy, and revealing that the stranglehold being imposed on Palestinians in the West Bank is happening not despite American power, but with American blessing and American military assistance and American diplomatic protection at the United Nations. You need to understand the economic dimensions of this stranglehold, because what is being described here is not just inconvenience or frustration, but the systematic destruction of Palestinian livelihoods through the control of movement, and UN experts have noted that work permits have been suspended for 100,000 Palestinian workers, slashing cash inflows that previously represented a quarter of all gross national income. meaning that the checkpoint regime has eliminated 25% of Palestinian economic activity at a stroke, plunging families into poverty and dependence, while these measures exacerbate heavy economic losses from the illegal taking of land and the illegal exploitation of natural resources by Israeli settlers in the occupied West Bank, creating a situation where Palestinians are simultaneously prevented from working and prevented from accessing the agricultural land that has historically provided their economic foundation. The strangulation is total, and it is deliberate, and it operates through mechanisms that allow Israeli officials to claim they are simply implementing security measures, while in practice implementing a policy of economic warfare designed to make Palestinian life in the West Bank unsustainable. And when Palestinians inevitably leave under this pressure, Israeli settlers move in to occupy their homes and their land, in a process that constitutes ethnic cleansing by any honest definition of the term, but that is described in polite company as settlement expansion or security measures, or the establishment of facts on the ground. The humanitarian consequences of this stranglehold are catastrophic, and they are getting worse, with OCHA documenting 1,680 settler attacks across more than 270 communities, an average of 5 per day, with the current olive harvest season marked by widespread assaults on farmers, trees and agricultural infrastructure, meaning that even when Palestinians can theoretically reach their land, they face violent attacks from settlers who operate with complete impunity under the protection of the Israeli military. Between 25 November and 1 December, 4 Palestinians, including 1 child, were killed by Israeli forces, bringing the total number of Palestinians killed in the West Bank so far this year to 227, a pace of killing that represents some of the worst violence in the West Bank since the Second Intifada, but that barely registers in international media, because the world's attention remains focused on Gaza, while the slower grinding destruction of Palestinian society in the West Bank proceeds with less visible brutality, but equal strategic importance. The Israeli government understands that international attention is finite, and that while humanitarian organizations and journalists are documenting the apocalyptic conditions in Gaza, they can accelerate the colonization of the West Bank with relative impunity. And indeed, there has been a significant surge in the number of military checkpoints, particularly following the start of the Gaza ceasefire, indicating that the IOF are exploiting the ceasefire in Gaza to escalate their violations and crimes in the West Bank, demonstrating the cynical calculation that violence in one location can provide cover for dispossession in another. What you heard in that clip from the Oxfam chief is testimony to a crime that is happening in real time with the full knowledge and support of Western governments that claim from the beginning, a judgment that captures the utter failure of American policy to match its universalist rhetoric about human rights with its particularist commitment to Israeli impunity, regardless of the cost in Palestinian lives and Palestinian futures. The systematic nature of what is being described here demands that we name it accurately, because the stranglehold the Oxfam CEO witnessed is not an unfortunate byproduct of a security situation, but rather the implementation of a political philosophy that views Palestinian presence in the West Bank as a demographic threat to be managed through making that presence economically and socially unsustainable, and this is apartheid by the definition used by human rights organizations and international legal experts, and increasingly by mainstream observers who can no longer ignore the reality of a two-tier system in which one population enjoys full rights and freedom of movement, while another population lives under military occupation with no political rights and no ability to move freely even within the territory where they have lived for generations, and the fact that this system is being implemented through bureaucratic mechanisms like checkpoints and permits, rather than through explicitly racial legislation, does not change its fundamental character as a system of domination designed to privilege one ethnic group at the systematic expense of another. The UN Special Rapporteur and multiple international human rights organizations have concluded that what is happening in the West Bank constitutes apartheid, and that Israel as the occupying power has an obligation to guarantee human rights to an adequate standard of living, work, food, water, sanitation, health, life, and freedom from torture or cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment, and obligations as the occupying power to maintain economic life for the benefit of the population, and not to illegally expropriate property, obligations that Israel is violating systematically and comprehensively with every checkpoint erected and every settlement expanded and every Palestinian business driven into bankruptcy because its owner cannot reliably reach customers or suppliers. The complicity of the United States in this stranglehold cannot be overstated, because every restriction of movement documented by OACA and every settlement expansion documented by Peace Now, and every killing documented by Palestinian human rights organizations happens with weapons and diplomatic support provided by the United States government, which has appropriated $117.9 billion in the first year of the genocide alone, in military aid to Israel, while providing the diplomatic cover at the United Nations that prevents international action to hold Israel accountable for violations of international law. And the Trump administration has gone even further by explicitly abandoning the two-state solution and giving Israel a green light for annexation, with reports indicating that they're looking at annexation of the West Bank with the E1 settlement plan, which it looks like the Trump administration has greenlit to some extent, meaning that the stranglehold being described is not a temporary security measure, but rather the infrastructure for permanent annexation that will formalize into law what has been the reality on the ground for decades, which is that Palestinians live under a system of military control without political rights, while Israeli settlers enjoy full citizenship and freedom of movement in the same territory. The economic consequences of the checkpoint regime extend far beyond individual inconvenience to the systematic destruction of Palestinian economic capacity. The closure of military checkpoints and metal detector gates at the entrances to Palestinian cities and villages has partially isolated them from each other and restricted people's movement, negatively affecting the economic situation, as the percentage of families living below the poverty line in Bethlehem has risen to 36%, demonstrating that what we are discussing is not security policy, but rather economic warfare that impoverishes Palestinian families by making normal commercial activity impossible, and this is happening while over 10,300 units within existing Israeli settlements in the rest of the West Bank are in the pipeline, and an unprecedented 49 new Israeli outposts have been established, meaning that as Palestinians are being economically strangled into poverty, Israeli settlers are enjoying government-subsidized housing and infrastructure built on stolen land, with roads connecting them, that Palestinians are forbidden to use. The two-tier system could not be more explicit, and it could not be more clearly designed to make Palestinian presence untenable while facilitating the expansion of Israeli settlement in explicit violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention's prohibition on an occupying power transferring its own civilian population into occupied territory, a prohibition that exists precisely to prevent the kind of colonial project that Israel is implementing in the West Bank, with full American support and European acquiescence. The humanitarian testimonies keep piling up in ways that should shock any conscience that remains open to recognizing Palestinian humanity, and Oxfam has documented that Palestinians living in the West Bank face daily harassment, humiliations, and the denial of their basic rights, which are being trampled by the Israeli military while conditions across the occupied Palestinian territory, including the West Bank, continue to deteriorate at an alarming rate, with the death toll in the West Bank rising each week as incursions by the Israeli military and attacks by Israeli settlers increase, resulting in injuries, deaths, and the forced displacement of Palestinians, painting a picture not of a conflict between two equal parties, but rather of a military occupation implementing systematic violence against a civilian population with the goal of making that population's continued residence impossible. And when Oxfam says that the international community must increase pressure on Israel to release its stranglehold on aid delivery, which is starving the population and making access to clean water and sanitation impossible, they are describing a policy that meets the legal definition of collective punishment and that constitutes a violation of the Geneva Conventions that the United States claims to uphold as the foundation of the international legal order, but apparently only when violations are committed by nations that are not close American allies. You need to sit with the reality that what the Oxfam CEO described is not a temporary emergency situation, but rather the crystallization into increasingly formalized systems of a long-standing policy of making Palestinian life unsustainable through the control of the most basic elements of existence. And when she talks about meeting with a chamber of commerce whose members cannot conduct business because they cannot reliably move goods or reach customers, she is describing the death of Palestinian economic independence, which has always been the goal of the settlement project, because a population that cannot sustain itself economically will eventually be forced to leave or accept permanent subordination to the occupying power. This is ethnic cleansing through bureaucratic violence, slower and less visible than the mass expulsions of 1948 and 1967, but equally devastating in its ultimate impact and equally clear in its intent, which is to clear the land of Palestinians so that Israeli settlers can occupy it without the inconvenience of having to deal with the indigenous population that has lived there for centuries, and the stranglehold of checkpoints and permits and roadblocks is the mechanism through which this clearing is being accomplished with plausible deniability, because Israeli officials can claim they are simply implementing security measures, while the cumulative effect is to make Palestinian economic and social life impossible. The international community's failure to hold Israel accountable for these violations represents one of the great moral failures of our era, because we are watching in real time as an occupying power implements systematic policies designed to make life impossible for the occupied population, while expanding illegal settlements in explicit violation of international law, and the response from Western governments has been at best rhetorical condemnation that is never backed by meaningful consequences, and at worst active support for Israeli policy through military aid and diplomatic cover and trade agreements that treat settlements as legitimate, despite their legality under international law. The European Union has documented that the government established a bypass legalization mechanism allowing 70 illegal outposts to receive government funding and infrastructure without completing formal approval processes, meaning that Israel is not even bothering to go through the motions of pretending that settlements follow any legal framework, but rather is simply seizing Palestinian land and building on it with government support. And yet European trade with Israel continues, and American military aid continues, and the stranglehold tightens with each new checkpoint erected, and each new settlement announced, and each new Palestinian family driven into poverty or forced displacement. The testimony you heard in that viral clip matters precisely because it comes from someone with institutional credibility, describing what they witnessed with their own eyes, cutting through the abstract debates about security and terrorism, to the lived reality of Palestinians who spend hours every day trapped at checkpoints not knowing if they will be able to reach work or school or medical care, because the occupying power has decided to close that particular road on that particular day, for reasons that are never explained and that follow no predictable pattern, because unpredictability is part of the control mechanism, keeping the occupied population in a constant state of uncertainty and anxiety that makes long-term planning impossible, and that corrodes any sense of normalcy or stability. This is the banality of occupation's evil, the way that systematic oppression is implemented through mundane bureaucratic mechanisms that allow perpetrators to avoid acknowledging the human cost of their actions by hiding behind security protocols and administrative procedures. And when the Oxfam CEO talks about humiliations faced every day, she is describing the psychological warfare that accompanies the physical restrictions, the deliberate degradation of human dignity that is built into every checkpoint interaction, where Israeli soldiers exercise absolute power over Palestinian movement with no accountability and no recourse for those subjected to that power. What must be recognized is that the stranglehold described in this clip is not an aberration from Israeli policy, but rather the logical continuation of a political project that has from its inception been based on the dispossession of the Palestinian people and the denial of their national rights, and the checkpoint regime in the West Bank is simply the latest iteration of a long-standing pattern of using military and bureaucratic control to make Palestinian self-determination impossible, while facilitating the expansion of Israeli settlement, and this pattern will continue until there are meaningful consequences for violating international law, and until the United States conditions its military assistance on respect for Palestinian human rights, and until European governments stop treating Israeli settlements as acceptable through trade and investment policies that normalize the legal colonization of occupied territory. The stranglehold will not release itself because those who benefit from it have no incentive to change their behavior as long as the international community continues to provide them with military support and diplomatic protection and economic integration, regardless of how severely they violate the rights of the occupied population, and the moral bankruptcy of this arrangement becomes more evident with each passing day as the death toll rises and the settlements expand, and the checkpoints multiply, and the international institutions that are supposed to uphold the rule of law prove themselves incapable of holding powerful nations and their allies accountable for systematic violations. This is where progressive politics must take an uncompromising stand, because what is happening to Palestinians in the West Bank is not a complicated conflict between two equal parties, but rather a clear case of military occupation implementing systematic oppression against a civilian population, and the attempt to frame this as too complex or too controversial to address clearly is itself a political choice that privileges the comfort of the oppressor over the rights of the oppressed. And if we claim to believe in human rights and international law and the dignity of all people, then we must be willing to name what is happening in the West Bank as apartheid and ethnic cleansing and collective punishment, and we must demand that our government stop providing the military assistance and diplomatic cover that enables these violations to continue. The stranglehold that the Oxfam CEO described will only release when it becomes politically and economically costly for Israel to maintain it, and that will only happen when Western governments face domestic political consequences for their complicity in Palestinian suffering, and that domestic political pressure will only materialize when enough people recognize that what is being done to Palestinians is not just unfortunate or regrettable, but fundamentally incompatible with any coherent commitment to human rights and international law, and the principles that we claim distinguish democratic societies from authoritarian ones.